Hi everyone, thanks for joining us tonight on this, our second of the Red Rose Young Farmer series. My name's Andy Bramall, I'm one of the farm vets and directors at Oakland Vets, and I'm going to talk to you tonight about fresh cows. So hopefully everybody's here now, and if they're not, they will catch up a bit later, but we'll make a start and try and get through this, so hopefully you'll find it interesting. If you have any questions anytime, can you put them in the chat function, and we'll have a look at them in the end and answer as many as we can. So what are fresh cows? Best to define this first. So there are quite a few different definitions out there, but fresh cows are generally considered cows in the first 30 days after calving, and it's during this period cows are at the highest risk of a number of diseases, and that's really why we tend to put a lot of focus on them. Now, approximately 75% of disease that a cow experiences is supposed to occur or tends to occur in the first month after calving, this fresh period. And it's during this period it has a massive effect on her future health, performance, productivity for the rest of lactation. You know, you guys will all have seen yourself if you have badly sick LDAs, bad case of ketosis, cows after bad calving may never quite do the same. And that's quite a lot of knock on then, both on that lactation and if it influences her fertility that time round, and the amount of time it takes to get back in the calf, it could potentially have implications on the next lactation and may lead to early culling. So it's vital really that we look at these cows closely, monitor their health, pick up disease early, and nip it in the bud really, so that we get the best outcome. And if there is an ongoing problem that we'll discuss later, we can start our therapy early, and also put into place any changes that might stop future cases. So how do we monitor fresh cows? Now, I'm not the biggest fan of really invasive monitoring unless we have to. I think these cows are stressed at the best of times. Really, it's a massive change for an animal. It's come from the dry period to into the milking herd. There's a lot of metabolic pressure as well as social stress settling in with the herd mates. So I think we're better starting really just by looking at these cows, and we try and pick the sicker cows out, or the cows that are struggling. We might want to investigate a bit further just by looking at how they're getting on. So the first thing is, how does she look? Like, you guys are great at that. You see cows every day. You know your animals. You know, you could tell me, you know, whether she's as bright as she normally is or not. Like, these are the first telltale signs, like yourself. You know, when you're feeling a bit under the weather, you know, people notice. How much milk are they giving? You know, we're milking these cows 2 or 3 times a day potentially. How much milk is she initially drops to 20% for more than a couple of milkings, or a more significant drop in the milking. We want to be looking at her. Do they get up and feed? You know, when you run past the front of someone putting fresh feed out with a mixer wagon, is there a cow hanging back, you know, on the bed or in a cubicle? You know, that's a telltale sign that that cow's not well. Rumen fills are another really good measure, really, when we walk down and look at these cows. You can see the picture on the right-hand side of the screen. There's a picture of 4 cows, and the top 2 cows there, I've got rumen fills of 1 and 2 out of 5. You call it this danger triangle that you can see, and a left flank's a real sign that a belly's empty. She's not putting herself up, and there's something not right with that cow. And the final thing really that we look at is just for any discharges, or put down RFM, retained fetal membrane, retained cleansings in these cows, or discharge from the eyes and nose, or anything really that shows that there's some sort of disease process potentially going on. And then the next thing really then, like, so once we've singled an animal out that we need to look at, is just stand back and use your senses. And it sounds a little bit silly, but it's really important just to stand back and look at these cows. And, you know, how does she look? Are there any swellings? You know, for the most part, animals are reasonably symmetrical. But, you know, is there a swelling on one side or the other? How is she stood? You know, is she obviously lame on a limb that might be causing the problem? Or are there any discharges from her eyes or mouth or vulva, like we discussed before? How does she smell? Foul smells generally indicate infection. We all know what it smells like when you've got a cow with a retained cleansing or a bad metritis. But it puts you straight in the right direction. Some of you might be able to smell ketones, possibly. I'm not that lucky. It's thought to be about a third of people that can actually smell ketones on cows' breath and diagnose ketosis that way. Some of my clients can smell it as soon as they walk into the shed, and I've got no chance. So I have to rely on a blood test or similar. Sound, is she breathing harder than usual? Is she grinding her teeth? Cow's grinding her teeth when they're in pain. And how does she feel? Like, a normal cow, like her ears should be warm, her tail should be reasonably warm. If these are cold, then it's a sign that her circulation's poor and she's potentially dehydrated, or there's something else affecting her circulation. So first thing to do, once you've got one of these cows that you want to have a look at, is get it somewhere appropriate to have a look at, such as like this crush or in a locked hedge oak or halted up, or somewhere you can have a proper look. She's not moving about the pen, and we can assess her properly. And it's important when you examine a sick cow that you do it in a reasonably structured manner, so that the results are reproducible, and you examine all cows in the same way, and you don't jump to conclusions and miss things. So I always start at the back of the cow, take a temperature, straight off there, we know whether we're potentially dealing with something infectious or not. And I also try and assess how well hydrated she is, or is she dehydrated. We do this by pinching the skin, which I'll show you in this slide here. On the picture on the left is an example of a fella here pinching the skin on the cow's neck. You pinch the skin up, let it go, and if it returns to normal in 2 seconds or less, you can say the cow's well hydrated. Now, if that skin continues to stand up there, we know she's slightly dehydrated, and you can do this on the back of the leg of the animal as well, just by pinching the skin. The next thing we tend to assess then is what we call the mucous membranes. So often we do this at the back end of the cow. We part the lips of the vulva and just have a quick look. Are they pink and moist? But you can do it in the cow's mouth, like in this picture on the right here, showing the membranes there. You can see that pink, which means that it's good circulation, good blood flow. She's not anemic, she's not in shock. And then moist, she's well hydrated. Then after that, we tend to move around the left side of the cow, listen to her rumen, and check that it's well filled, check she hasn't got an LDA, listen to her heart and her lungs, move around the head, and listen to the right-hand side of the heart of the lungs, check for a right displaced adenosine, and then move to the back end. Once we're there, we tend to perform a vaginal exam, particularly in fresh calf cows, to check whether they're clean, how they're doing post-calving, is there any cleansing left, and then follow that up with a rectal, check the quality of the muck, size of the uterus, and finally check the udder. It's amazing how quickly some cases of mastitis, particularly things like E. coli and other toxic mastitis, come on, and you milk this cow out, in the morning, first thing, 5, 6 o'clock, you notice she's off. We come out to 10:30, there's nothing wrong with it. Back at 5, 6 o'clock, or by 10 o'clock, we've got water milk there, and we can see what's going on. And the final thing then is any extra tests, such as blood tests. So you'll quite often see us doing things like blood ketone tests, or occasionally we do other tests, or take blood samples to run back at the practice. So what's normal for a cow? I've put up a table here of some roughly normal parameters for an adult dairy cow. And in a beef cow, the heart rate and respiratory breathing rate might be a little bit slower. In a calf, the normal temperatures perhaps slightly higher. The range we perhaps consider up to 39.5 normal in a calf, but for an adult cow, we're looking at something in this range of 38 to 39.3 we'd consider normal, and anything outside that range we'd be worried about. So a temperature of 40 degrees, we'd be concerned there's some sort of infection going on somewhere in her. You see heart rate, respiratory rate, mucous membranes as well, and skin tend to be a sign of dehydration. And the bottom thing I've got on there is a level of blood beta-hydroxybutyrate or blood ketone. So in fresh cows, we'd consider anything below 1.2 millimoles per litre as a normal ketone. Some of you might have ketone meters on farm at home and use them to monitor your cows, and it's a really good way of checking that cows are transitioning well. We've talked about these pictures before. So the next thing I wanted to just touch on was a few common conditions of fresh cows, and I don't know quite whether everybody's seen some sort of animations before, but this is a really good animation. It's come from the University of Montreal, actually. I should give them credit for this, but it shows how an LDA works. I'm not sure whether you can see my cursor properly, but if you look at the animation on the right, we've got a picture of a cow there, head on. So we can see on her right-hand side, we can see the sort of darker red, purple structure is a liver. On her left side, there's the sort of grey structures, her rumen, and on the left-hand edge, that's her spleen. But if we come down to her lower right side, her abomasum sits there, and that's the normal position of her abomasum, her fourth stomach. And this is the stomach that we often encounter problems with when we talk about twists, so twisted stomachs or displaced abomasums. And in this case, we are going to watch an LDA, a left displaced abomasum or left twist, and we're going to see what happens in those cases when the stomach moves around to the left-hand side. So I'll just play it now, and you can watch it there. Move under the center of the cow and start to move up on her left-hand side. You can see there it now starts to fill up with gas. And we get to this point now where the stomach's fairly well dilated there, and it's filled up with gas. It becomes quite buoyant, and for the most part becomes stuck there in most cases, and we tend to operate on these cows and to bring it back round to the right hand side of the cow. But you can see once it's gassed up there, it's fairly well stuck. And the cow on the left there, the horned cow, the red triangle really outlines where we listen for them. So you'll often see us on farm flick the cow's ribs and listen next to where we flick with a stethoscope and listen for a metallic pinging sound. What we're listening to there is the air fluid interface in the stomach stuck just under her ribs to detect it. So that's a left twist, and here we're going to look at a right twist. So these are two pictures, two animations. The first one we'll show you is a right twist happening, or an RDA and torsion occurring on this of the right side of the cow. So again, you can see the cow's liver there at the front. At the top of the liver near midline, you can see a kidney. You can see the colon and rectum, then going towards the back end. And the sort of small bit you can see sticking out about halfway down towards the back end, so caecum that looks a bit like a little alien. So I'll play this video now and show you what happens with a right twist. You can see now the stomach stops working properly. It twists round on itself and then dilates. And this is why these tend to be a more serious condition in fresh cow. If you sort of watch closely, you might have noticed that the stomach changed colour to a more of a purple, and that's because as the stomach twists round on itself, it forms a bit of a tightening which cuts the blood supply off, and slowly then the tissue starts to die, and that's why these are more serious, that actually the tissue's degrading then the whole time it's like that. So the video on the right will then demonstrate what we do really to correct these on the right hand side. So we start to untwist them, and as we do, the gas moves and straighten the stomach out. And the bit that isn't included is generally we then put a stitch in it and fix the stomach in place there to the right hand side of the body wall, so it can't happen again. And this picture here is just to demonstrate where we then listen for those two things. So the red circle shows where we listen for an RDA in a similar way to the left twist. The left displaced abomasum, we flick the ribs over that area and listen for this tympanic ping, this pinging sound that indicates that we've got a structure there filled with fluid and gas. The blue circle just indicates where we would listen for a dilation in the caecum or a cecal torsion. occasionally we can see the cecums of the cows blowing up and twisting, particularly on cows that are on lots of concentrates. The concentrates tend to cause a bit of fermentation in my gut. The picture here really demonstrates where we listen to the lungs on the cow. So as you notice, it's quite a long way forward, really, and that's because on the left-hand side we've got this mass of rumen pushing the diaphragm and the lungs to some degree forward, which is quite a small area to listen to. But that would be the area you'd listen to, the left lung. So after this, really, I'd like to move on and talk about gateway diseases. So this might sound a little bit heavy, but this is a really important part of fresh cow health. Really, we're looking at diseases here that make cows more susceptible to other things. That's what we're getting at. So a gateway disease really opens the blood barriers to all the other things. So if you're seeing lots of retained cleansings, metritis, mastitis, DAs, poor fertility later on, dirty cows, they can often be traced back to a few different causes in the fresh cow. And so the two biggies really that we look at routinely are ketosis and milk fever, or hypocalcaemia, low blood calcium. So milk fever is the sort of common name for hypocalcaemia, low blood calcium. And I suppose the main message I wanted to get across to people today was that whilst there's clinical disease that you'll see, and clinical disease is so for milk fever or hypocalcaemia, clinical hypocalcaemia is your down cow, she's down on the floor, you give her a bottle of calcium and she recovers, and you see her sick. Likewise with ketosis, it's your cow that's her milk's down, she might be showing, she might be a little bit twitchy and off colour and showing some neurological signs. But the other part of the puzzle is the subclinical disease. So the iceberg's quite a nice analogy for this in a way, that for every 1 or 2 cases of milk fever we see, there are a lot of cows then below the surface that have low blood calcium and low enough that it's causing them problems. It's leading to poor immunity and poor muscle function. It makes them more susceptible to DAs, twisted stomachs, and holding on to the cleansing. But it's not really enough to knock them off the feet and see them down as clinical milk fever. So you might see 5% of your cows or 2% of your cows getting milk fever. But there could be 30, 40, 50% that potentially have low blood calcium and it's causing problems. It's actually causing some of the reasons why your fertility is not as good as you'd perhaps like it to be. So really these are things that it's important that we address and we monitor. It leads to most of the other things. So the first one I want to talk about was ketosis. So I imagine everybody's potentially seen a case of ketosis or come across one diagnosed on farm. But what is it? It's a metabolic disease that's caused by a buildup or an excess buildup of ketone bodies in the blood. So ketones are a normal source of energy that the body uses as an alternative, and they are sort of well tolerated and useful in small amounts. But as the body struggles and produces too much, they can cause problems. So you might know it as another name, slow fever, something called acetonemia, and it has various other names, but we generally know it as ketosis. It's traditionally seen as a clinical disease, so these would be cows with abnormal behaviour, potentially the smell on the cow's breath, the sweet smell. People say it's supposed to smell like pear drops. I can't smell it personally, so I have no clue. And it generally occurs in cows in early lactation. I had a colleague once that even went to treat a cow at one stage, recall because she was drowning. So the cow was that bad with ketosis that she was pressing her head against the wall over the water trough and drowning herself in the water trough. So it can be fairly extreme. And it's present to some degree in nearly all herds, but very common at a subclinical level. So the cows have enough ketones that it's causing the problems, but not enough that you would actually see her as off colour with ketosis. But it may lead to things like DAs or poor immunity and other conditions. Why does it occur? Well, most mammals in early lactation, the end of pregnancy, tend to be in negative energy balance due to them sort of looking after their offspring. In late pregnancy, they've got a great big calf in the belly that's reducing how much they can eat. And in early lactation, they've got a rapidly produced hormone. The body produces these ketones, alternative pathway, and they work quite well. But where we really struggle is then when it goes too far. And like I say, it has always happened, but the problem that we have now and why it's more difficult to manage is that over the last 50 years or so, we've selected quite hard, particularly with dairy cows, to make them produce more milk, which puts more pressure on the body, and it ultimately sets the body up to divert more nutrients directly to the udder. But the rest of the body still has to survive on what it can get and survive on these ketones. But as the udder takes more and more away, more and more ketones are required to be produced and are produced to meet the energy demand. And often we find these cows just slipping the wrong side of the balance. So there's a few different forms of ketosis, like I alluded to earlier, and they're classified in different ways. But the traditional type we used to see was called, it's classified as type 1 ketosis. It usually happens 3 to 6 weeks in milk. And generally it's because yield in cows peaks before appetite. So yield peaks somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks in milk, whereas appetite can be 8 weeks or so. And so it leaves a little bit of a gap there with the cows where, you know, if everything's not right, she's not conditioned as well as she should, or she's perhaps a little bit over conditioned and she's not eating as well, that it slips the wrong way and it can end up with ketosis. Rarely we see ketosis due to highly deuterated silage. It can cause it, but I think for the most part, silages now are very well made and we rarely see it. The other type, and the more common type we tend to see now, is type 2 ketosis or fatty liver. And a lot of you have heard vets talking about this, and she's got fatty liver, you know, and relatively poor prognosis. So it was called type 2 ketosis because it's linked to type 2 diabetes in human people who share a similar sort of physiology. But it's due to excess body fat mobilization during the late dry period and early lactation. And the fat then collects in the liver because the cows in particular species are really poor at dealing with liver from their fat from their livers. So other species are slightly better. You know, we can mobilize fat from our body reserves, process it in our liver, use it to make energy, and get it back out. But cows are particularly poor at this. So we see our fatter cows that mobilize lots of fat, it gets the liver, and essentially gets stuck there, which means that they can't use the fat, but it also impairs the liver's ability then to produce glucose and other energy, because the liver's the main source of that. So it sort of becomes a little bit of a vicious cycle. We generally see this in fresher cows in the first 3 weeks after calving, generally in fat cows, partially because fat cows have a poor appetite. So the fatter cows, the hormone release from the fat tends to suppress appetite, and they mobilize fat more readily. So you get these fatter cows that get towards calving, the big calf in them, and then they're not eating as much as they should. They start to mobilize the fat. The fat's more sensitive, it mobilizes more, and we end up with it clogging the liver up. That can be very hard to deal with, because ultimately, whilst we can support her, the only thing that's really going to help her is time. You know, she's got to slowly get rid of that fat out of the liver to get back on track. But they're not all fat, and there have been some studies to show that fatty liver can be caused by overfeeding during the far off dry period, which has been linked to insulin resistance by overfeeding these far off dry cows. I think particularly we sometimes see it around here in cows sort of mid-summer, mid to late summer. Dry cows have been turned out in spring, they're put out onto lush pasture, and they probably overfeed then during the far off dry period, gain a bit of weight. And we sometimes see slight runs on twisted stomachs and ketosis during the later summer. So I've got a really complicated set of diagrams here. Don't worry about them too much. But the picture on the left shows really what goes on in a normal cow. We've got the gut, the adipose tissue, and the triglycerides, the fat coming in, and the liver in the middle. It's fairly normal. The cow on the right, you can see it's got a lot more triglycerides, a lot more fat tissue, and the fat tissue is more sensitive. And you can see all the stuff that starts to go wrong. It's more fat mobilized, it gets stuck in the liver, it doesn't get metabolized properly, and that leads to more and more problems, and it becomes a bit of a downward spiral that can be hard to solve, and it's potentially fatal in some animals. We don't need many cows with fatty liver, but every now and again, we'll see maybe a dozen or more cases in the practice every year where some of these cows don't come right, they're permanently short of energy, and their livers are just so full of fat that they're struggling even just to meet the demands of life. So why is all this important? Well, it comes again back here. You see subclinical ketosis there. These cows are struggling with ketosis or fatty liver potentially. And look at all the arrows there, all the links to different diseases from ketosis. So you can see poor fertility on the left, poor ovary function, longer carbon intervals, DAs, clinical ketosis, metritis. So you can see actually where potentially getting it wrong on the ketosis side of things. If you have got too much in your herd, that it can massively knock on to all the other diseases. And then there have been various studies that have looked at what having a subclinical level of ketosis in your herd can do for disease, and we really want to avoid our cows looking like that picture on the right, but just over a 5 times risk of LDAs, 1.5 times risk of retained cleansings, 3.5 times risk of metritis, 6 times risk of cysts, 2.5 times risk of early culling, it's a biggie, 1.6 times risk of mastitis, and twice the risk of lameness. So actually having that there as an invisible disease potential in your herd could potentially be costing you mass in terms of profitability and cow health. So how do we find out actually, whether you've got this or not? Because we can't see it. We can potentially see the problems of having it. We might have more twisted stomachs than we want, or fertility might not be as good. We have more dirty cows. But actually, how do we diagnose this? So blood's the absolute gold standard. We take a blood sample from these cows during the first 3 weeks after calving, and we measure that on hand keto. So a lot of you might have seen us use these on farm, or maybe have your own. They're cheap and readily available. They're around £20 for the meters, and the strips are a couple of pounds each. And you get a drop of blood, possibly from the tail vein, put it onto the meter, and roughly 10 seconds later you have a result. So that's great. You can measure it, measure ketones in the milk and urine. They're not as accurate as blood. The tests tend to cost as much, and so we don't tend to use them a lot. For those of you that milk record, this can be quite a useful indicator. So there's some reasonable correlation between fat protein ratios, so the level of fat and protein in your cows on average. So you can see in this picture at the top right of the screen, the dotted line across the top, the green band's roughly a normal fat to protein ratio, not fat to protein. You can see the line going up and down, and at the far right there, it's sort of shot up a little bit, and levels over 1.5 are roughly indicative that there could be a ketosis problem in the herd. But like I say, it's only a guide. I wouldn't hang my hat on it. If I saw that change in one of my herds, I'd be keen to do some more diagnostic looks and see what's going on. And smell, with the clinical cases, around a third of people can smell one of the ketone bodies acetone. If you're one of those lucky people, that's great. So how would we monitor? Like I say, luckily it's not as invasive as this kind of treadmill on the right, testing fitness. We use the meters like the one in the bottom left of the screen. And we start by 3.5 dozen cows in the first 3 weeks after calving. And we'll probably start looking at them every other month to start with. Obviously, if we're getting a lot of positives, then we do more. So a level of more than 15% of cows with a high ketone is associated with increased disease risk. So if 2 or more out of those 6 cows have got high ketones, then we need to think about this. It's potentially costing them money. Let's not wait for these cows to get to the point where they're calving and not calving when we're serving them and PDing them and seeing that we've got poor fertility or seeing more disease. Let's step on it straight away and try and get to the cause of the problem. And like I said before, clinical cases tend to be poorly reflective of how much subclinical. So just because you potentially have one case of ketosis in the herd last year, doesn't necessarily correlate with how many subclinical cases you have. So we did a study ourselves, Oak Hill did a study in 2016, and we took 6 farms and we did nearly 400 blood ketones on them, as well as body condition score of the cows to see what effect that had. And so it was quite interesting. So you can see here, these are the results, the totals at the far right, and then each column's an individual farm. You see the massive variation. So we're looking at this third column down, what percent of the cows we measured had high ketones, and this varies right up to just over a third of the animals affected, which is quite a lot. It's well beyond our sort of lower limit, or upper limit, sorry, 15%. And this, this farm was seeing some problems here. And as you can see, is cows lost a lot of condition. They lost, they went from nearly 3 to 2.5 by the time they were high. And we found that correlated quite well, actually, how much body condition they lost with how high their ketones were. So the other thing to remember about ketone testing is that if you sampled every cow once in those first 3 weeks, and you found 37% had got high ketones, if you sampled those cows every day for those 3 weeks, roughly twice as many of them would have ketosis, because by sampling once you miss some. So the actual number of cows with some level of ketone problem, we're getting on towards 3/4 of them at that stage. But the other thing to remember is, like I said earlier, it's not all about fat cows. Thin cows tend to be more susceptible to disease and infection, so we want to stop. We want to have a look at these thin cows and make sure we haven't got any of those and what the underlying reasons for them are. But importantly, for what we'll come on to next, is that the risk of milk fever is around 30% higher in fat cows over conditions for 3.5. So how do we stop subclinical ketosis? First things to look at your heifers. Age at first calving. We get these heifers calving down at 24 months. We don't end up with sort of fat, stale heifers calving down. Those fatter, stale heifers calve down and they have problems with fatty liver. We struggle to get them in calf. They have a long lactation, which means they gain condition towards the end of lactation, and then they tend to calve down again with problems. So not to be too pessimistic, but sometimes we can, if these heifers calve in, we can have problems throughout the rest of their life. We need to manage our sort of staler cows, our cows that we struggle getting in calf and near the end of lactation are giving a lot of milk. We need to manage them well to make sure they don't gain body condition. And we need to work really hard on fertility to make sure that we get cows in calf quickly, calf down with a good calving interval. We keep that under 400 days, and we don't have too many stale cows that potentially gain body condition, body fat towards the end of lactation. And then the other things really all come down to the dry period. Stocking density is a massive thing. We get too many dry cows in the barn together. You don't want them sandwiching like these like in the lift here. We want them to have plenty of space, we want it to be low stress, plenty of space to lie down, to eat, and generally stress-free, so they can do everything to the best of their ability. But ultimately, however well you do, you're always going to have some cows that carry more condition or are more susceptible. Those ones that we're scanning calf with twins or had problems last time. And there is a role there for potentially some of these supplements, such as Keystone boluses that you may have seen, choline and methionine we can feed to dry cows to help reduce the risk. But they're not they're a sort of sticking plaster, and they help, and they help with these high risk cows. But you know, we need to get everything else right first. You know, if you're seeing problems with ketosis, subclinical ketosis, you know, ketosis works as a good way of getting you out of the problem. You know, or we're using them on high risk cows, but they're not the entire solution. Bradley Wiggins here mainly talking about marginal gains here rather than any drug-related issues. But they do. Ketone work well. They reduce the risk of LDA, ketosis, mastitis, and they're a great product for high-risk cows, but not necessarily a solution. You know, stocking density, if there's too many cows in the barn, or we've got issues with the ration, they're not a solution for that. How can we treat these cows? Propylene glycol. Propylene glycol is probably is the main treatment. There are potentially some other supplements that help, but the main way we treat these cows is by drenching them daily for 3 to 5 days with some propylene glycol. It just provides an extra energy source and helps plug that negative energy balance gap. So what would I like you to take home from this bit on ketosis? Do some blood ketones at home. You know, get your vet to do some, get a ketone meter and do some yourself. It's invisible, and it may be costing money to find out whether it is. And good fertility is essential. Good fertility is essential to stopping so many diseases. It's absolutely paramount to most dairy businesses' profitability. So the other condition I was going to talk about, and will talk about now, is milk fever, or hypocalcaemia, to give it its proper name. So see this girl on the right here, she's got clinical milk fever. She's down, she's flat out, she's bloated. And it usually occurs within 24 hours of calving, but can occur before. And we do randomly see some cases throughout lactation. Sometimes cows have been stressed and not eating, or have something else going on, and we see a cow down, which is 200 days in milk. She responds quite well to bottle of calcium, she goes on her way well. But for the most part, it's in the fresh cow, and it's due to this massive increase in demand for calcium from the body. When the cow calves to produce the milk, the calves is a 2 to 3 times increase in the calcium required, which is massive. And milk fever then occurs because the cow's body, in some cases, just can't meet that demand quick enough, and blood calcium levels drop off to the point where it causes problems. Older cows tend to be poorer at mobilizing that calcium quickly, and it leads to these sort of progressive neurological muscle signs. So you may have seen them really early on where they're a little bit twitchy, and they soon lie down, and eventually, if they weren't treated, the animal would die. So how does the sort of calcium metabolism work? Well, what's supposed to happen is that the parathyroid gland, you can see here in this cow's neck, senses low blood calcium. It secretes its hormone. It stops the kidneys secreting, excreting as much calcium, so they retain a bit more calcium in the body there. It causes the kidneys to metabolize a hormone, which makes the intestines absorb more, which can take a few days. And it also then causes the bones to release calcium, which can take a few days. So massive calcium in the cow. Plenty of calcium in the cow. That's not necessarily the issue. It's just the cow being able to mobilize what she requires quick enough, which sometimes she fails at. And these graphs just demonstrate that really. So the red lines are a cow with milk fever, and you can see that massive drop in calcium, which actually starts pre-calving. And this is a cow that would have gone down, and you can see how long it takes to recover. But likewise with ketosis, we also see, and now this is the green line, some cows that have low blood calcium, but it's not enough to knock her off the beat. It won't put her down, but it is sufficient that she begins to struggle. You know, calcium is really important for muscle function, and it can affect immunity. So she's maybe slightly weaker. You might see more cows slipping over and having injuries. You might see more dirty cows, potentially more ketosis. So the message here is a little bit like the ketosis, is that you can't see this subclinical or invisible level of low calcium, but it's potentially having a knock-on on your herd. So some, and these are American studies, so maybe slightly different to the situation in the UK, but show nearly half of cows from lactation 2 onwards on normal diets that aren't formulated to stop them having low calcium. Nearly half the cows there have low blood calcium and are not causing problems. We do some testing throughout the practice. I think 50% is perhaps a little bit high, but we see varying levels. Some farms, 3/4 of the cows have it, and some farms it's 10%. It's massively affected by diet, really, as well as dry cow housing. The issue that we have in this country is that we make lots of cuts of silage from lots of different fields with different levels of slurry on, and they all have different levels of minerals in that affect calcium. So why is it important? Well, this low level, this subclinical level of invisible level of low blood calcium, subclinical milk fever, causes a 3 times increased risk of nephritis. This picture of this uterus here with the fetid fluid in on the right. These cows are 2.5 times as likely to have a fever after calving, more likely to have high ketones, and they have an increased age, so they take longer to get in calf. So this was a study a while ago, and on average in the study, the cows that didn't have low calcium took 109 days to get in calf, and if they had a low blood calcium, it took them 24 days, so a significant difference. If you think each day open costs you about £3.50 to £5 a cow, depending on what you read. How do you diagnose it? Again, it's a blood test. We diagnose it by blood. It's slightly more onerous than doing ketones because we have to do it the first day after calving, first 24 hours, and ideally before we give them any calcium, because that can mask the results. So we look for normal results 2 to 3 and try and target 75% being more than 1 if we consider that normal. There's a couple of results here below from a couple of cows. So there's the top one here, you can see the calcium is 1.74, and that's a cow with subclinical ketosis, with subclinical milk fever. And the one at the bottom that's down at 1.18, this cow has clinical milk. This was a down cow, so you can see the difference here. We need to do a blood sample really to measure this. Once we've decided that potentially we've got too many cows with low calcium, how do we control it? Well, traditionally on farm, going back, people would have done calcium reduction, so they'd cut all the calcium out of the diet, which in theory is a really good way of doing it. If you can get calcium level low enough, the body sees that low level of calcium pre-calving. So this is for dry cows. We lower the dry cow ration in calcium. While she's dry, that she upregulates the hormones and she's better at mobilizing calcium. So when she calves down, she's ready to meet that extra demand, which in theory is very good, but actually is very, very hard to achieve in practice. And the only way we can do that successfully is by using calcium binders. So some of you might feed calcium binders on your farm, things like zeolites. They're quite effective. They bind up calcium in the diet and reduce then the level the cow's got, and it makes it then better at mobilizing. But you need to be able to formulate some sort of way of feeding those cows in the last few weeks before calving that separately. So what a lot of farms do, in particular on smaller farms, works really well, calcium supplementation at calving. So we use boluses like the Hyocalcaemia, and we give every cow second lactation or third lactation on a calving a bolus and one the following day. Works really well. Got plenty of calcium in them, and you don't need a separate ration for those cows. The only problem you might think though is that as we look at those graphs, the calcium levels coming down pre-calving, and we're only really correcting that afterwards. How much effect does that have? Possibly some, but it is a workable solution that has some really good results. I'm going to touch on two other things that are two other ways of controlling milk fever that are perhaps a little bit more complicated, but you'll have potentially come across them. So some people will feed mag chloride in the diet, which works. The magnesium sensitizes the parathyroid, the calcium hormones, makes the body better at mobilizing calcium. And it also contains some chloride, which helps with the decab. So I'm going to try and explain decab for those of you that don't know. Some of you have come across this before, but decab or decad diet are one way of controlling blood calcium levels. It stands for dietary cation and ion balance. So cations are positive ions in the diet, and the anions are the negatives. So we're talking about sodium and potassium on the positive side, simplicity, and chloride and sulfur on the negative side, as you can see in this picture on the right with the scales. And by adding more negative or reducing the level of the positives in the diet, we make cows better at mobilizing calcium. That's all it's about. So we take the overall level of these things and they come out at a figure, and it might be 200, it might be 50, but the lower we get that level, and certainly once we get it below 50, the cow becomes much better at mobilizing calcium. So when we feed my chloride, we add chloride in, that's a negative, that reduces the decab level and potentially helps milk feeder. The problem we have with these diets is that we need a separate group of closer cows to feed them to. Feeding lots of chloride, or we can feed things like ammonia chloride, that also has that negative effect on the decab. Whilst their effects on this, they don't taste very good. Cows don't like eating them, so we're limited to the amount we can feed. But it is a potentially a successful way, and we use it quite successfully on a number of farms of improving calcium metabolism in cows. So we take all the ingredients we work. Every feed has a decab level. We work out what it is, and we change the diet about to reduce it. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a slightly complicated idea to get your head around, but in effect it's really simplicity of it is that we're looking to reduce the decab level of the diet to improve calcium metabolism. The final thing I just wanted to touch on really quickly is fresh cow checks. So this is my last bit really on things to do in fresh cows to monitor performance. This is a vaginal examination and an ultrasound scan of the uterus in the cows from 3 weeks post-calving. And we look at the samples we get, and you can see in the picture on the right here, there's 4 different levels of what we call dirty cows or cows with endometritis. And the white stuff floating as pus, so a sign of infection, bits of bacteria and white blood cells floating together. And these are a really good way to monitor how well that your fresh cows are doing. We've got lots of dirty cows, we've got a problem, and that might be low blood calcium, might be ketosis, might relate to your bull's thrown some big calves and they've had some bad calvings, or you've had to help calve a lot of cows, or you've calved a lot of cows recently, there's been a bit of stress on them. But they're a really good way to monitor your cows, and it's really important to clean these cows up quickly. So depending on what you read, it takes somewhere between 10 and 30 days more to get a dirty cow and cow under the price in calf. So it's vital that we pick these up early and treat them, get them right, hopefully keep fertility where we want it to be. Finally, this is just a quick example of a disease recording sheet we tend to use on our farms. And we record levels of calvings, retained cleansings, nitritis, mastitis, milk fever, DAs, lameness, all sorts of things really. And it's a really good way because it don't tend to be things that you record in milk recording or anywhere else. Come to the end of the year, we look back, or we look back at the last few months, and we can see what changes we've had in the levels of fresh cow disease, which is really useful for monitoring performance. We correct the subclinical milk fever problem. Do we get less disease? So that's it. That's about it from my talk. So I'll just have a look, see if we've had any questions in. We can just whiz through a few of those. So the first one, is there an on-farm independent test to find out if blood calcium level is low in subclinical cases. Not that I know of. There are, well, that's not strictly speaking true. There is a company released a type of blood tube that you could use to tell if blood calcium was low, but it wasn't very sensitive, really. It's probably only really useful to tell if a down cow's really low in calcium. And actually, when doing some research, was taught there was a little handheld meter that a company was marketing to use to tell what calcium levels were in blood, but they didn't have a price for one, so I imagine it was expensive, and it was very temperature sensitive. The samples had to be warmed, I think, to 20 to 25 degrees C. So the short answer to that is no, not really. But we talk to some of our clients, and if they're happy taking blood samples, or they want to learn, we're happy to teach them, and they drop the samples in, and we run them here at the practice. You don't necessarily need a vet out to do them. You take the samples yourself, just run them in, and we can run them here through our machine. Second question we've had here is why do cows get an RFM? Why do cows get a retained cleansing? So there is probably not a straight answer to this, and there are lots of reasons that a cow can get a retained cleansing. The two things we talked about today, low blood calcium and ketosis, are two of the biggies, really. If I was having a run at retained cleansings, I'd certainly want to look at calcium fairly early on and check levels of ketosis. We'd probably also take some blood samples from your close-up dry cows, see how much body fat they're mobilizing, and potentially look at things to do with stock and density in dry cow diet. So it's a bit of a wishy-washy answer there, but I think really the two things that we talked about today are the two biggies I'd like to take up first, really. So the other question we've had, is there an upper limit on the milk you should take off the cow at the first milking to help the calcium status? There is evidence to suggest if you don't milk a cow out as much, that you put at less risk of milk fever. We have a mix really in the practice. Some people do just milk the cows right out, and people that have particular problems would take less of them. Obviously, if you drain them more, then for that first milking, you take more milk away, you'll get more milk potentially at the next milking, which means more calcium and more risk. Personally, don't have massively strong feelings on it either way. I think if you're having trouble at the time, that maybe reduce how much you're taking a little bit until we get through it. But there's also taking the milk off to flush out the gland and help stimulate milk production to some degree. So I think that's all the questions we have at the moment. So if anybody has any more questions, please feel free to email them in. We'll get back to you. Thank you all for listening. It's great to see so many people here. Hopefully you found it interesting. Like I say, the main thing I really wanted to take away today is this idea of subclinical disease, and actually just because you can't see something doesn't mean it's not there. Of course, it's really successful. So the next meeting in the Young Farmer series is the fertility meeting, which will be really good. Fertility, like I said, is a massive part of farm performance and economics. So Sam's going to talk about that. Sam's got a diploma in reproduction, so he's really good on fertility, and that'll be really interesting. So that's actually Thursday next time, the 21st of January. So we hope to see as many of you as possible there. And the final thing to say is that the Young Farmer members are offering 10% off any of our Oakhill Red Rose courses going forward. So have a look at our website, our Facebook, see any courses you like, please get in touch. So I'm going to sign off for now. Say any questions, please email through. But thanks again for attending. Hope to see you all at some point. Right, bye then.